In this video, I will show you how to make a simple pivot table out of the employee list on the sheet Employees. We will build a salary costs per office. But before we start, I need to tell you something about the data that needs to be ready for the pivot table. So what we see here is data that have a header in the first row. That means it says what each column contains, and then we have in another row we have the employees. So the general rule for the pivot table is every row needs to be equal. So one row, one employee. In other cases, like we have here, daily sales, one row is 1 day of sales, or it can be one invoice, or one transaction, or one trip sold here in the travel agency. So they need to be the same. There must not be any subtotals. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say I sort it by office, and let's say some data contain stuff like, let's say Berlin total. And I would put like manual or automatic subtotals like that, showing Berlin total. That's actually not acceptable for pivot table. Pivot table needs to have like a raw data without any additional calculation or extra rows. So I will delete that row. Also, pivot table does not like merged cells. So sometimes people like to merge cells like that. So there will be like one big cell that says like Office Berlin, or maybe like that. So merging cells doesn't work for pivot tables. It wouldn't recognize it as a separate rows. So let's not do that. So let's go back. Also, pivot table needs to have all rows filled. So if there would be like a table that would always only show the name of the office for the first employee, and we somehow assume that the other employees are from the same office, it would not be clear for the pivot table. So the pivot table needs to have all the information for all the people. It's okay though if there would be like a missing information. If, for example, that employee would not have an office, it would not be treated as a Berlin office employee, but it would be treated as an unknown office employee. So this is how data should look like. There can be up to 1 million rows, which is the maximum in Excel. So I will click and insert a pivot table, and the data gets automatically selected. You see we have 100 employees, so it wants to select a list sheet of employees from A1 to H101, which is correct. But there might be empty rows in a data set like that. There will be like an empty row, or maybe like an empty row after each city. There will be like a possible situation sometimes appearing in lists like that. That's generally not a problem for a pivot table, but you need to be very careful when you are selecting the data. Because if you click here and click Create Pivot Tables, as you can see here, it only tries to create a pivot table from the top part. You would have the same problem with creating a filter or something like that. If you stand in a table, if there's an empty row, Excel considers that as a separate table. I will show you how to remove empty rows in one go. So if you have a long table, you would like to make sure there are no empty rows. You would just like select all the columns, go to Data, turn on the filter, and then use any of the columns to filter the blanks. Let's say on the gender. And I see these are all empty, 11, 21, and 41. I will select those and right click and delete row, and then clear the filter. And that's it. So only the clear rows were selected. Be really careful to check the rows. If there would be empty rows and you would insist on keeping empty rows, then when creating a pivot table, you need to select the full table, including the empty row, maybe like that. or maybe even the full columns, but that creates some additional problems we will talk about later. So if you select those, and then you can go insert pivot table, and then it would understand where you would like to take it, and the empty row would make no problem in general. What is especially dangerous is when the empty row is somewhere below what you see when you open the table. Let's say somewhere here. I go up and I click OK, nice data set. I click create pivot table. I don't check it anymore, and then I will be surprised about the data, because actually, as you can see, there is empty row and not all the data got automatically imported into the pivot table. So first thing to remember, be careful about empty rows or subtotals. So there must be header in the row number 1. There must be in every column needs to have one information. There must not be any merge cells. There must not be any empty cells, unless it means like really empty, if the information is missing. And if there are empty rows, be careful to import all that data. So let's do that. Let's create a new pivot table. So I create a pivot table. And let me explain you the user interface of the pivot table. Right now, I don't see any data. I still need to do some adjustments. I need to tell Excel which data I would like to see. What I see here on the left side is where the pivot table will be. You see, the pivot tables are usually created on a new sheet, sheet 1 in our case, unless you tell Excel otherwise when creating it. So this is where the pivot table will be. What you see here on the right side is pivot table fields. This is like the mission control of the pivot table. You see here, you see all the columns, we call them fields, name, gender, age, etc. And then there are like 4 brackets that you use for controlling the pivot table. When you are in a pivot table, you see also 2 additional tabs here, pivot table analyze and design. So, but if you click anywhere outside of this range of the pivot table, let's say here, everything will disappear. But don't worry, you can just click back and you will see the information once again. If you by accident close this pivot table fields while being in the pivot table, don't worry, you can go to the Analyze tab and field list here on the right. If you click that, you will get the field list replaced. So as I promised, we have a office. So what I got is, if I put the office into rows, I will get a list of all unique offices in my data set. That's quite practical. And now we would need to find some values for the office. What is the information that we would like to know? And we would like to know the sum of salaries of all the people working in these offices. So this is the values field. So if I put salary and drag it to the values, you see automatically it will turn into sum of salary. You see the format is not very neat, so you can just select it and on the home tab change it back to the currency that you need, which is euro in our case. So you can format it as a regular table. So what I got here is a sum of salary. I can easily sort the table, going to data and sort. If I click here, let's say Z to A, it will be sorted with the city with the highest sum of salaries, which is Prague, and the city with the lowest sum of salary, which is Sydney in our case. We can also filter in those, but the filter works a little bit different than in a table. You don't filter by column. Both columns are filtered using that field. So then you choose label filters. This is the offices. These are labels, and value filters. This is for filtering these things. So you can, for example, do that. You can filter like only some particular cities that you choose. Let's say Berlin, Bratislava, and Cape Town. And you will see only these. You see the filter is active. So I will go back. Or you can use the value filters. You can see, for example, let's filter only the offices. Okay, I will clear the filter from office right here to see all the cities once again. And now in the values, I would only want to see offices where the sum of salary is greater than, let's say, 200,000 euro. And you see it's filtered. Or I can filter, let's say, only offices that are top 10. That doesn't have to be top 10, but it can be, let's say, top 3 items by sum of salary. So top 3 offices with the highest salary costs. And these are Prague, Tokyo, and San Francisco. And I will clear the filter once again. So this is how you filter and sort in pivot table. There is a lot more that you can do with the pivot table. That was just like a quick introduction.